All right, today we are diving into the world of a really fascinating poet from the 17th century, Richard Crashaw. Now, this was a man of incredibly deep, intense faith, but his writing, it's bursting with a kind of passion that might, actually surprise you.
And yeah, that brings us to the real puzzle of his work. I mean, how does a poet who's writing about God and spirituality end up using language that's just so emotional, so ecstatic, and frankly, so sensual? It's this exact contradiction that makes him stand out, even hundreds of years later.
So here's how we're going to unpack all this. First, we'll get to know Crashaw, the man. Then we'll dig into what made his style so unique. We'll explore his biggest work, break down the core themes, and then we'll see where he fits in today. All right, first up, let's get a handle on the man himself. Who exactly was this poet of passionate faith? So Richard Crashaw was technically part of a group called the Metaphysical poets. But honestly, he was marching to the beat of his own drum. You got to remember, he was living in a super chaotic time in England, full of religious and political drama, and all of that absolutely shaped who he was and what he wrote. The words that really jump out here are ecstatic and mystical. We're not talking about quiet, polite prayer here. No way. Crashaw's poetry is trying to grab that feeling of being completely overwhelmed by a divine experience, something that hits all of your senses at once. And it's that very intensity that made him such an outlier. So let's talk about how he really broke the mold. Okay, so check this out. Most of the other famous poets of his day were all about being clever and intellectual. Lots of witty arguments and brainy comparisons. But Crashaw? He just went in a totally different direction. He cranked up the emotional fervor and embraced this rich, over-the-top style that was just way more dramatic.
So where did this all come from? Well, you can boil it down to three huge influences. First, he converted to Catholicism, which was a massive deal and connected him to a whole different European tradition. He was also really into the Baroque art style. Think grand, dramatic, emotional stuff. And finally, he was deeply inspired by mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote about her own spiritual experiences in these incredibly personal and passionate ways.
And all those threads, they all weave together in his single most important collection of poems. It's basically a roadmap to the heart of his faith. It's called Steps to the Temple, and it came out in 1646. This is his masterpiece. And it's not just a random collection of poems either. The whole thing is structured to take you, the reader, on a spiritual journey.
I mean, the title says it all, right? Each poem is meant to be a single step, moving you closer and closer to understanding the divine. He wants you to feel like you're climbing up toward God. It's an active thing, not just something you read.
So what are these steps all about? What kind of ground are we covering on this journey? Let's dive into the major themes you'll find in his work. First up, and this is the big one, is divine love. But the way he writes about it, it's almost shocking. He uses the language of intense, earthly romance to try and describe a spiritual love for God. For his time, that was incredibly bold, totally unconventional.
But it's not all fire and ecstasy. Crashaw could also plumb the depths of human sorrow. His most famous poem, The Weeper, is all about the tears of Mary Magdalene, and it's just this incredibly powerful piece about grief and the desperate hope for forgiveness. The emotion is so raw, you can almost feel it.
And finally, there's this deep, almost overwhelming sense of awe for sacred rituals. Remember, as a convert to Catholicism, he wrote about things like the Eucharist with this incredible reverence. His poetry really tries to make you feel the mystery and power in those moments of faith. So with a style this unique and this powerful, you've got to wonder, what's his legacy been like? Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest.
Back in his day, people knew he was doing something new and different. But then styles changed. The next era was all about reason, restraint, and order. And Crashaw's passionate, emotional style, it fell completely out of fashion. For a long, long time, he was mostly forgotten. It really wasn't until much later that people rediscovered his work and started to appreciate his insane ability to describe things that are almost impossible to put into words.
And that brings us full circle, right back to our original question. The paradox is actually the answer. Crenshaw's genius wasn't about separating the spiritual from the physical. It was about smashing them together. He seemed to believe that the only way you could even begin to talk about something as huge and infinite as God was to use the most powerful language we have, the language of human passion. So it kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it? Are there some things in life, some truths, that are so big, so profound,
that you just can't get there with quiet, logical language. What can we only really grasp when we push words to their absolute most passionate and even contradictory limits? Something